Greetings, scholars, and welcome to one of the world's finest ivory towers, Simon Fraser University, Surrey campus. Now, I can think of no better place for today's subject of medieval education than right here. So, if you're ready to learn, just come with me, and if you're not, I'm sorry, but you're just going to have to come along on the ride anyways.
Kyle Ross, the history boss. Kyle.
Today's episode is going to focus on the many interesting aspects of medieval education. Now, medieval education is different from current day education for a variety of reasons. Now, the entire educational process was much more open. To give you an idea of this, a teacher at one school could easily teach at a completely different school without even being re-examined. Also, schools had a large degree of autonomy that is observed in universities today. Also, the educational process was conducted by monks, by priests, even sometimes by bishops, and these people often had little educational experience themselves. And without any further ado, I will now turn it over to Mr. Narrator.
Thank you, Kyle Ross. I'm glad to be your narrator and host through this fascinating time period, if I do say so myself. It is interesting to note that during the medieval era, the majority of the population was illiterate, and few mastered the art of reading and writing. Education was very limited, and most of the noble men took great pride in being trained as knights.
So knights had 5 key virtues. Now, the first virtue was prowess. Prowess was their skill in battle, very important if you're a knight. Number 2 was piety. Piety is your devotion to religion. Number 3 was loyalty, and I think you know what that is. Generosity, you may also have an idea of. And love, well, who really understands love anyways? But these were the 5 key virtues for a knight.
A knight's education focused mainly on the ideals of religion, honor, and gallantry. There were 3 distinct stages of education which prepared a child for knighthood. 1, from birth until 7 or 8 years, a boy was trained by his mother. The education centered on religion, respect and politeness towards one's elders, obedience to his superiors, and the foundation was laid for strength and health.
Now, at age 14 or 15, the boy would become a squire, and this grade of knighthood allowed him to walk, play chess, and hunt all manners of dangerous creatures. He would also take the lady of the house to any battlefields or any tournaments and escort her and wait on her.
The boy was also trained in the arts, learning the harp, pipe, song, along with reading and writing in order to compose a verse. In some cases, he was trained in Latin, but not all.
Did you know? Harry Potter is one of the many trends inspired by medieval education. Nicholas Flamel, the sorcerer and also Dumbledore's best friend, was in fact an actual person. In reality, he was an alchemist who actually made a philosopher's stone. However, it sadly did not prove to be as magical as the movie did. Now you know.
The education curriculum that existed in the Middle Ages consisted of liberal arts, law, theology, or medicine. Liberal arts were arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, music theory, grammar, logic, and rhetoric. The trivium and the quadrivium had students focus on grammar, logic, rhetoric, geometry, arithmetic, astronomy, and music. In university, most students studied these areas for 6 years. Once they completed the 6 years of schooling, they received their bachelor's title. And, if they continued their studies, they could receive their master's, and eventually a doctor's title.
Now, that's not so different from the current educational process. Now, did you know that medieval children were actually taught to specialize in adult roles? Children were not taught as students, but as workers, and the work began at the age of 5 or 6. And actually, the death of children was not seen as a big deal in the medieval ages. During the Middle Ages, there was no concept of childhood. Each kid was treated sort of as a mini-adult.
Did you know? Medieval education survived only under the approval of the church. However, many villagers themselves still practiced the wrong kinds of faith. For example, the sickness magic taught that if a child was ill, 2 connecting holes in the ground must be dug, and the child must be dragged from one throughout the other in order for him or her to restore their health. Now you know.
The church encouraged learning and commissioned artists to produce some of the finest structures in the world. many of which are still present in the modern day. The Church oversaw and managed the education of European people, but they did give independence from local influence and freedom to speculate to the universities, which resulted in their declarations being highly valued. However, formal schooling outside of church schools was rare until the 10th century.
Those who had little desire to lead a religious life often had little to no education.
By the 11th century, before the Viking Age, universities were being founded in Bologna and Oxford. These universities were not marked by buildings or campuses as they are in modern day. Universities instead revolved around people, not places. The term university was originally applied to any body or gathering of men. Tuition was generally free. Bologna University was operated by students. They sized up a teacher and paid him depending upon how well he taught. Teachers had a reputation of being harsh with those students who didn't learn their lessons. Class sizes varied greatly. Informal schools had small class sizes, while schools in large cities could have more than 100 boys in attendance. School days could be quite long, and boys were sometimes at school for more than 12 hours. Most of the students were from noble families, and occasionally there was a smart peasant.
Did you know that most schools and students did not have access to books, as they were very expensive at the time and sometimes just plain didn't exist on the subject being taught?
Did you know? Medieval education taught not only biblical knowledge, but also spatial relationships. Mappa Mundi, a very popular map used during the Middle Ages, was one that laid out the cities of Europe with surrounding territories occupied by cyclops, monopods, dragons, ogres, and trolls. Many of these images became inspirations for movies like Lord of the Rings, Narnia, Pan's Labyrinth, and many more. Now you know.
Now to bring our focus to the education of women during the medieval era. Education for them existed in minimal amounts, especially for peasant women. Some daughters of nobility were offered education as a way to increase their standings within society. The education of women during this era was focused on practicality and household demands, and not at all on academics. The majority of well-educated women, though, in this era were nuns.
One of the most notably educated nuns of the medieval ages was Hildegard of Bingen, who was given permission by the Pope to teach, preach, and write several theological books.
To bring to light one important individual in the era of medieval education is to talk about Charlemagne. He started a program to increase learning and literacy, which is now known as the Carolingian Renaissance. Charlemagne relied on some of the most scholared learners of his day, Peter of Pisa, Paul the Deacon, and the Saxon Alcuin. He also issued capitularies to the abbots and bishops, which allowed for the establishment of schools at monasteries, cathedrals, and within villages.
Charles Martel was the first ruler who sought to educate the population. He strived to move education away from being purely about religion and church and move to more practical things like math and Latin.
So what did medieval education contribute to modern-day education? The most striking contribution would be that it promoted the preservation and institutionalization of knowledge by developing an organized framework and codifying it. The medieval ages helped to develop courses of study, the process of examinations, and the path of gaining a degree. Bachelor's, then master's, and then doctor. An interesting fact I would like to end on is that there are over 7 primary and secondary schools which are still running today that were opened during the medieval ages. The oldest university in Europe is in Bologna.